Alright, guys, we are here again going over another quiz 2. I have a lot of family at my house right now, so sorry if we get interrupted or if I have to tell someone to get away from my door if they knock on my room or something. So just letting you guys know. um, so this quiz here is going to be Cooper's quiz from the 2017 spring semester, so last semester. Um, yeah, all right, so this is the quiz. Let me just go ahead and label some of these classes. This is the parent class, so this is the first class, and the child class is the second class. Second class. Let's see. That's the third class. All right. So we'll just go ahead and get started. We'll just go ahead start with the first class here and see what the requirements are for that. So the first class is the parent class, and it tells you that you're going to have two string array attributes in the instruction. It tells you the two attributes for this class will be string arrays, and then it just says include any other methods that are required, that you believe are required. Okay, so that's it for the first class. For the second class, it tells you that this will be the child class. This class will only have one attribute, and they don't give you a description for this attribute. Okay, so that kind of tripped me out at first too, but as we work through this, you'll kind of see why they were kind of vague about that attribute. So child class, first, this is the child class, one attribute, no description for what type of attribute you're going to need. And then it tells you have one constructor. This constructor receives a license type, and then this constructor performs some kind of function, or it performs some kind of command where this command does the following. If the license type has a value of S, the attribute is assigned the array of values of the state array in the parent class. And then I put this is the if true action. Then there's another command that says if the license type does not have an S, the attribute is assigned the array values of the territory array in the parent class. So, and then it has include any other methods. So let me kind of go ahead and break this down for you guys. So we have the parent class, and then you have the two string array attributes. One of the attributes holds the names of states. The other attribute holds the names of territories. So since these are array attributes, you know that these attributes are going to be holding multiple things inside the array, right? That's the point of an array. So one array holds the name of states, and then the other array holds the names of territories, and then it says include any other methods. Okay, and then in the child class, it's saying, all right, we have this constructor, we have this vague attribute, but inside this constructor, we're going to perform a certain command that is going to check if there's an S in the value that I have received in this constructor. We are going to receive a license type, so we're going to check if that thing that I received has an S. If it has an S, then the attribute that belongs to this class will be assigned the values in the state array from the parent class. If the license does not have an S, the attribute will be assigned the values in the array of the territory array from the parent class. And this is the if false action. And then it says include any other methods. So right now, just reading through the requirements of this stuff, I can, something that I'm trying to get you guys to see is the code that they're asking for. And that's why I kind of like caps lock or uppercase the if, because that's like a very obvious sign that they want you to do if statements, and they want you to do an if and else, because this is the if true action, And when an if statement is false, you're going to need your else. So I'm going to say this equals else. Else keyword. This equals the else keyword. If I can spell, I can never spell. Yeah, so that's basically what I'm trying to get you guys to see here. Another thing is they're saying if this is true, I need the values from this array to be set to this vague attribute. Well, it's no longer vague because depending on how your if statement turns out, whether there's an S or not, if there's an S, you're going to assign array values to an array because you can't assign an array to a regular variable. I can't assign a string array to a string variable. I have to assign a string array to a string array. I can't assign a string array to a double variable. So they didn't give us a description for the attribute very explicitly, but they're giving it to you implicitly when they're describing the if statements, because they say, hey, if something happens in this if statement, whether it's true or false, we are assigning an array to something. And in Java, you need to make sure that those two data types line up. So if I need to assign an array to something, well, that array needs to be assigned to a string array. So I will no longer say that there is no description for this. I will say this. I will say attribute is a string array. Okay. Also, if I am going to assign something to this attribute in my child class that is in my parent class, well, I need to return that. How am I going to get those array values in this child class if there is no return statements or return methods in this parent class? So that's what it means by include any other methods. So I'm gonna write a note and say dot 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 dot. The child class needs the values that are stored in these parent class attributes. I will have to include methods that return these values. Okay, so right there you take care of include any other required methods. Okay, for the most part. I'm not looking at the visuals yet. Okay, I haven't even looked at the visuals yet. I'm just going off of what the requirements are for this quiz. So automatically I know I need to return these arrays here so that my child class can accept those things that are being returned and then assign them to the attribute. And then this one says include any other methods. Now I'm not gonna go as far into say, okay, I know these are gonna be return methods. I'm gonna go and read what's up with the third class and see what I might need. So the third class is you need two attributes. One attribute takes on a true or false value, and then the second attribute is assigned a string called stm. All right, we have one method. It asks the user for a type of license. So if I'm going to ask the user for something, I know that's a J option pane. Then it checks to see if a value entered is appropriate. If that's a hint. Checks to see if a value entered is appropriate. Does it match the second attribute? If yes, then assign the first attribute a value of true. All right, so let me slow down here. In the instructions, the very wordy instructions, it's telling you to do all this stuff. I just simplified it. So you're going to ask the user for something, and then that something you ask for, you need to check and see if the value entered is appropriate, which basically means, does this value that was entered, does it match something? If it does, assign it true. Okay, and right here it says, does this does it match the second attribute? So I'll kind of be more detailed. Does the value entered by the user match the second attribute? If yes, then assign the first attribute a value of true. All right. So we're going to take that value entered, we're going to check it, say, hey, does this value entered match the second attribute? If it does, I need to assign a true value to the first attribute. All right. And then it says the value of the first attribute is then checked. If it is true, do the following. All right. So in this step up here, let me separate these out. In this above step here, we check that user input to the second attribute. Now it's saying whatever it is that you do to that first attribute, depending whether you assign it true or false, if it is true, do the following. An object that consists of the first and second class is created. So we're just going to create an object. And it's going to be of the first and second class. So that means you're going to create the object for the child class, I believe. So let's make sure I'm right on that. Yes, because remember that the child class has the parent class within it, but the parent is only the parent. The parent doesn't know it has children. So it's telling you specifically, create this object for the first and the second class. So if you want two classes in one, you're going to have to go with the child class. You'll have to create this object through the child because the child has itself and the parent. Okay? If you create the object through the parent, then you're excluding the second class because the parent doesn't know it has children. So when you create this object, like I said, you're going to want to create it through the child class. Okay. So you create this object, you pass the object the value entered by the user. All right, so you're just going to pass that thing that the user entered, and then you call a method through the object, and the value returned is assigned to a variable that represents an array. All right, so again, call a method through the object, and the value returned is assigned to a variable that represents an array. So here, whatever object you create, whatever you decide to call it, it says use the object, call a method. So right here, I'm going to say, okay, so I'm going to use an object to call a method. The proper syntax for that is object name dot some method. So it says call a method through the object, and the value returned is assigned to a variable that represents an array. So object name dot some method, and they want to assign. This is how I will use my object to call. This is how you use. This is the syntax or the piece of code that allows you to call methods through objects. So here's my object. Here is some method that belongs within inside that object, and we need to take whatever it returns. Whatever that thing returns, I'm forgetting that right there. Whatever that method returns, it needs to be assigned to, a variable, which is an array. So if we think about it here, I'll give you guys a second to ask yourselves, so far, what type of arrays am I working with? And I'm going to pause and let you think about that. So you've been working with string arrays, right? We haven't mentioned any other arrays. So if I'm going to use an object to call a method that returns an array and then assign it to a variable which is an array, well, it'll look something like this. Since we know we're just working with string arrays, I'm going to say string array, and I'm going to call it array1 equals. And actually, you know what? I'm going to do square brackets just so I won't confuse you guys. But yeah, this will be the piece of code that you use to use methods. I'm sorry. this will be the piece of code right here, what I'm highlighting. So this is the piece of code that allows you to use objects to call on methods. And if that method returns something, well, it tells you explicitly that, hey, this thing that it returns, I need to assign it to a variable that represents an array. So then I'm going to say, all right, I'm going to use this object, I'm going to call some method that returns an array, and then I'm going to assign it to an array variable. And you know it's an array variable because you say, hey, this is a string array. The name of my array variable is ARR1 equals my object that I'm using to call some method, and this some method returns an array. All right, so that was a mouthful, but that's the basic idea. And so then you do that step, and then the array values are displayed in the terminal box. So whatever is returned here will be displayed in our visuals on the quiz, and we're going to start taking a look at those in just a moment. And so that's what happens if it's true. If the value of the first attribute is false, then you just display the error message, which in the visual says you entered H. Only one of the following letters is allowed, STM. Okay, so here you're basically you know, if you kind of see what's going on, this whole section here is an if else, right? If true, do this big chunky part. If false, just give me an error message. And that's the basic idea for your program. So hopefully some of those like nuances and those very vague kind of things make some sense after we kind of went into depth about the description of, you know, the requirements for this program. All right, so we can go ahead and get started now with actually coding it out. And I believe that the easiest class to start with would be the first class. Yeah, it would definitely be the first class. So this first class has a couple things in it. It has two string array objects. All right, so two string array attributes. So we do private. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's look at the visuals. So yeah, sorry, I got a little too ahead of myself. Let's see. The displays below result from executing the program 3 times. With the user input shown below, your code should result in the output exactly as shown below. All right. So don't worry about it saying it's executing 3 times. Like it's just all that's saying is like, okay, if I were to do this 3 times, this is what it would look like. Okay, so will the user input shown below, with the user input shown below, your code should result in the exact, okay. So we have an input box and it says enter a single letter that indicates the type of license, and you put an S. Array values are Texas, Utah, California. Okay, so now let's think about this. It tells us in the instructions here, if the license type has S, the attribute is assigned the array values of the state array. Okay, so here, if you're looking at your quiz, if you enter a single letter, if you enter the letter S, you get the terminal box which shows Texas, Utah, California. So that makes sense, right? Because in the problem it says if you get an S, you will assign state names to your attribute. Okay, so that makes sense. And then it says enter, the second visual is enter a single letter that indicates the type of license, and the person puts in an M. And so then the value, display box says array values are north, south, east, which makes sense because if the license does not have an S, the attribute is assigned the array values of the territory. Okay, and north, south, east sound like territories, so that makes sense that if it's not an S, I'm going to get territories in my terminal box. So, and then the third one says, it says the same message, and then it says the person puts in an H. And then the error message goes like this: you entered H. only one of the following letters is allowed. STM. Okay? So you see through the messages or the visuals here that only three things are allowed. STM. When a user puts anything else besides STM, they're gonna get an error message that says you entered this letter. It could be anything, Z, V, X, whatever. You entered this letter. Only one of the following letters is allowed, and then it gives you the STM output. Or it just shows you the STM string. Okay, so those are the visuals. So I'm looking at that and I'm like saying, okay, when I get S, I have to get the state names out. When I get anything besides an S, I can do one of two things. I can either print out north, south, east, or I'm going to print out an error message because I am only allowed to get STM in order to show north, south, east, or Texas, Utah, California. So I'm just saying to myself, all right, when a user puts in anything besides STM, they're going to get this error message that says you entered this and then whatever. So, well, not whatever. You entered this and you're only allowed to enter STM. All right, so now that we broke down those visuals, now let's go ahead and start coding. So, all right, we have wrong class. So the reason I'll start out with the parent class is because it's very simple, very straightforward. Like we can code this in 2 minutes. All right. So then there's not a lot of stuff going on. So I would, the simplest classes are always the easiest to start out with for the most part. So I will go ahead and start coding out my private string arrays, or just my array attributes, private string. And then we're gonna call it, oh well, let me go ahead and stick to whatever they call it here. Okay, they call it state array. So this is my state array equals Texas, Utah, and then private string territory array equals north, south, east. All right, and okay. Okay, yeah. So that's the first step there. But one thing I will point out is they do not explicitly tell you to fill in these string attribute arrays with these specific values. So they don't tell you that. They don't say, hey, create these arrays and then put Texas, Utah, California. Oh, actually, you know what? I think they do tell you that. Sorry about that. Let me double check. This class is a parent. This class has only 2 string array attributes, one that holds the names of 3 states, Texas, Utah, and California, and one that holds the names of 3 territories, north, south, and east. Okay, so whenever you declare, so they do tell you explicitly, my bad, when they tell you these attributes are going to be string arrays, well, you should, hopefully you've had some practice up to this point with arrays, and you should know, okay, well, if my array is supposed to hold Texas, Utah, California, I am going to set this attribute equal to, these specific values. And this is how you do that. You have, as far as an attribute goes, you have private, you have, string array. I'm declaring a string array. Then you name it whatever you want, but we're sticking with the answer key names. You name it whatever you want, and then you set it equal to, the parameters, or not parameters, sorry. You set it equal to the values that you want this array to represent. And you do that by saying equal curly brace. These are strings, so put them in a string format. So open quotes, open double quotes, Texas, Utah, California. And then you do the same thing for the territory array. So that's the first step in this one. They told you that explicitly in the instructions, that these arrays were going to hold these values, okay? So we took care of that. Okay, and then it says include any other required methods. So whenever we were breaking down the quiz, we said that the child class was going to need these arrays. So in order for the child class to receive those arrays, I was going to have to return them. So then, you know, that would be the next step is, okay, I created my arrays. I know that my child class needs the arrays. Let me go ahead and set this parent class up so that they can return them to the child. So we will go ahead and do that. And let me see how they name it here. So we'll do a public return string. We're returning a string data type, and they call it return state array. All right, and so then we return state array. All right, and then we also need to return the territory array. So we do public string array return. I'm pretty sure they call it territory array. Return territory array. Return territory array. And that's it for this class. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. I try to break this. I try to break it down as much as I can and get you to connect the dots. But the big thing about this one is they throw in that include any other methods stuff on there, and they only told you to do this explicitly. So whenever you see, okay, I'm supposed to include any other methods that I need, but how do I know what I need? Well, you kind of know that by reading around and being like, okay, how is my child class related to this parent class? Am I going to just be creating objects, or am I going to be passing stuff around between the parent and the child, or whatever? Or am I going to need some of the stuff from the state or territory class in the third class? Like, you got to look at those things to see, you know, how is it all kind of connecting together for you to find out what are those other methods that you might need. And we know that we have to send these arrays to the child class, so we obviously need return statements there. So that takes care of that. And so now I would say that the child class is the best thing to continue with because it's a lot simpler than this class, as you can see. So we'll go ahead and move on to the child class. And we have one attribute, which we figured out was a string array. String. And they call it appropriate array. And then, so we figured that that was a string array. And then we have a constructor that receives a license type. Okay, so if we look up at our visual, we see that the message says enter a single letter that indicates the type of license. Okay, and then in the instructions for the constructor, it tells you that you receive a license type. So putting 2 and 2 together, you know if you're going to be passing a license type to this constructor, what you're passing is a string. And they, in the quiz, call it license type. Okay, so we have received our license type, because I could see how someone could get confused and be like, okay, I have my constructor, but it's supposed to receive a license type. Like, how am I supposed to receive it? Well, that's why looking at your visuals is very useful, because in the visuals it tells you, hey, you are going to input a license type, okay? So that lets you know, all right, when I input something into an input dialog, that's a string. So obviously I'm passing around a string, but even more, you didn't have to go into it that far. It just says if the license type has a value of S, and it tells you it's in a string format, and it tells you in the problem. So it's like, oh, okay, I'm receiving the license type, and then I'm comparing the license type and seeing if it is an S. So then that means I'm comparing two strings here. If I'm going to check to see if something matches S, well, in order for it to match it, it has to be a string. So I must be receiving a string in this method. So those are two different ways you could have said, you could have figured out, all right, what type of data type, what kind of data type am I receiving? So you receive the license type, and we go and say that if this license type is equal to S, the attribute is assigned the array of values of the state array. So we need an if statement. If license type dot equals, ayo, slow computer, equals S. Whoa, what the heck happened there? Equals S, close and close. So if the license type equals S, attribute is assigned the array values of the state array. So what's my attribute in this case? Appropriate array is going to have to be assigned the state array in the parent class, all right? So we are in the child class, so we have access to things that are in the parent. So I can just say, all right, I want to assign my appropriate array attribute the state array in the parent class. How can I do that? Well, I created a method that returns the state array. So I will just call on that method, return state array. So what I'm saying there, did I misspell something? Return state array. I don't think I misspelled something. Don't know why it's doing that. Return state array, return state array. All right, we'll see. Maybe I need to do something else. Okay, so return state array, and then we do else if okay, so then this is if it was true. So if license type is equal to S, assign the state array to my attribute. If it is false, if the license type does not have an S, so if this is all false up here, then do the following. Assign the attribute the territory array. Return territory array. And okay, so I'm not sure why this is giving me a syntax error. Return, did I do something wrong in the methods? Sorry guys, I'm just trying to make sure why it's not letting me, I'm not sure why it's giving me these syntax errors. Oh, sorry folks, this is child class. I forgot to say it extends the parent. Boom. But I'm still getting an error for this. Return territory. Sometimes I misspell stuff, so yep, territory. Welcome to coding, guys. If you misspell some stuff, it'll haunt you. All right, so then that's gone. Sorry for the hold up, folks. Okay, so if the license type does not have the value of S, so if this is false, the attribute is assigned the values of the territory array in the parent class. This is the if false action, which will require the else keyword. So that's all that was right there. Okay, that's all that was. So that takes care of the first constructor. Some of you guys might be looking at this and being like, wait, why are we using dot equals? How come we can't just do like license type double equal sign S? Well, that's not the proper way to compare strings. I've put out videos of the equals method and stuff like that, so just look it up. And so yeah, this is the proper way to check if this thing that you received equals S. All right, and as you know, as we work through the quiz and the instructions, it says if this is true, assign your attribute for this class the values of the state array from the parent class. If it's false, assign this attribute in the child class the array values from the territory array. And we're doing that by calling the return statements or the return methods, return state array, return territory, and then setting it equal to our attribute. Okay, and then it's saying include any other methods. I believe we will have to return this array, just like we knew that we were going to have to get these values to the child class. Well, from the requirements of this class, they gave us most of the work of, okay, if it's this, assign this array. If it's that, assign this array. So that's what we did here in the constructor. And then it says include any other methods. So to me, as I read through the quiz, I know that here I'm going to have to display the array values in a terminal box. Okay? It says I do that here in the third class. It doesn't tell me I do that here in the first class. So then I can't do it here in the first class because it's not telling me to. That's not how the program's supposed to be structured. So that's kind of a sign that's showing me, hey, since you're not displaying these values in the child class, all you did was assign them to the appropriate array attribute. Since you're not displaying them here in this child class, but you need to display them in the third class, how are you going to do that? And so again, you have to use some kind of logic, and you have to tell yourself, all right, I need to display the values that get assigned to my appropriate array attribute in this class. I need to display that in my third class. How can I do that? Well, you do that by returning the appropriate array. So then you do public string, oh Jesus Lord, public. All right, public string return appropriate array. Yeah, so what did I do? Appropriate. Sorry, just treating it like a method. So yeah, then that would take care of my include any other methods kind of, description of, hey, what else should you include? Well, the something else I should include is a method that returns the appropriate array attribute to the third class. Okay, that is can I move this? Yeah. All right. That would be the method that I needed to include. So I hope that makes sense to you guys. Again, the way I figured that out is by understanding that the third class needs to display the values, not the child class. The child class has the values. I need them in the third class, so in the child class, I will have to create a return method to get those values so that I can display them. All right. So then, now we're in our third class, and we will go ahead and get this one started. So we have two attributes here. It takes on a true or false value, and then the other attribute is assigned STM. Excuse me, I'm yawning. I was yawning in the last tutorial video too, so I guess I always just get sleepy. But all right, so those are our two attributes, and we will go ahead and code that out. Yeah, so it should have been kind of intuitive to find out, oh, okay, license type is a parent and a child. License type is a child, state of Terry is a parent. So the third class obviously is going to be the main class. That's why I had to code out the the main method there. And then I know y'all are probably looking at this and being like, wait, how come these attributes are static and the other ones aren't static? The best way I could tell you is everything in the main class is going to need to be static. Your methods need to be static. Your attributes need to be static. The only time you would want to use static in like parent or child classes is whenever you're kind of keeping like a running count of things and you need to show those updates and share those updates among all classes that attribute or that variable has been shared in. That's one way you would use static in a parent or child class or whatever, just like a or just like a second class or whatever. Also, you would use static in a parent or child class attribute or method whenever actually, you know what, let me just stop right there, because what I was going to continue on could be like a very 50-50 kind of thing. So I will just leave it as everything in your main class needs to be static, attributes and methods, everything, because it's all going to end up here in the main method. And if you see, the main method here is static. And I feel like the only way it would work is if it knows that everything that's in there is somehow also static, right? Okay, so that's that. Also, another thing, you might be saying like, why is this false? If it's supposed to be true or false, how come you put it false? Well, excuse me. Oh man, I'm tired. All right, so for the most part, Cooper always makes the default value of a Boolean false, and by default, even if I didn't, by default, even if I didn't, hello, missed that, hello. So is, even if I didn't make is good input equal to false, the value of is good input by default is false, even though I'm not explicitly coding it out. So he does that as just good practice because, you know, it doesn't matter if you're a good coder or an experienced coder, like you might forget that the default value for booleans is false. Okay? So he does it just for good practice, but what I have on the screen right now is just as appropriate. You know, it's probably not best practice, but it gets the job done. Like your code will work either way if you put equals false or if you don't put equals false. So that's why he puts it there. Me personally, I don't like putting equals false because it's more coding I have to do. Like it saves me a second or two from having to type it out. So I just don't do it. You know, if it's not necessary, I don't do it. So yeah, we'll go ahead and stick to the way he does it because, like I said, it is good practice to do it. But yeah, so that's why he did that there. But dude, like honestly, it could be you could set it equal to true if you wanted to. The reason I say it could be whatever is because you're gonna be changing this value depending on a certain outcome. You know, if you remember here, we're saying, you know, depending on what is entered by the user, this attribute is going to change. So if the user puts in an input that is going to result in a false, well, then I'm going to change this true to false. And it would be the same thing if this was initially kept at false. If the user puts in something that will change it to true, well, then I will assign it true. And so, you know, that's another reason why it's static is because I'm able to change it and stuff like that. So yeah, that's that. We'll leave it at false. They wanted you to set the second attribute to the string stm. We did that there. And so then we get rid of this. I'm just going to write another little note. Main class. Okay. Take a sip of water real quick. Maybe it'll wake me up. Some good H2O. All right. So then the first method, ask the user for a license type. Okay. So we're going to ask the user for a license type, and then we're going to check to see if the value entered by the user is appropriate. If the value matches the second attribute, then we assign the first attribute a value of true. So there's a couple things here. We've all done JOption pane so many times at this point, I'm not going to break that down. What I am going to break down is this if statement comparison. Okay, so if I need to take that thing that the user inputted and compare it to the second attribute, well, I'm gonna have to store that user input somewhere, right? So automatically I'm thinking, oh well, first before that, import javax.swing star, right? So before I make a mistake with the J option. So I need to store that input somewhere. I need to store that user input somewhere. So obviously when we use J options, it turns things into strings automatically, and we're comparing strings. So let's say string entered license type equals and then we have to hit it with the message where it says enter a single letter that indicates the type of license. All right. So we're going to give the user this input, and then they're going to enter something, and we're going to store that something into the to the variable entered license type. All right. So we take care of this part. Take care of this part, and then we check to see if the value entered is appropriate. So basically, what that says is, we need to see if enter license type equals STM, or does it equal something in STM? Yeah, okay, because that's one thing to notice is that the user in the visuals is inputting only one letter. He's not putting in STM. He's putting in S, M, and H. So all we need to do is find one character in STM. We don't need to find STM in as a whole. We need to find an S, we need to find a T, we need to find an M in order for this program to not pop up with an error message. So there's a method for that, and it's called index of, and I've made videos about it, so look that up, but I will briefly explain it. So if I want to take this user input and see if this input is an S, T, or M, or if it's in here, because I'm not saying I'm not gonna do this if entered license type dot equals S, or oh shit, entered license type dot equals T. Okay, and like I'm not gonna do. Don't get me wrong. You could do this. This is completely. This is another way to do it. Honestly, it's a longer way. Um, it's a longer way. It's right, but it's just a longer. It's a longer way to code, and um, why code all that out when you could do a more simpler version of it? But like I said, this is right because what you're saying is, okay, if this user input is equal to an S, then do the following. If the user input is equal to a T, do the following. Or if this user input is equal to an M, do the following. That's true because you want S, T, or M. You know, S or T or M. You want that. And if you don't have that, then you give the error message, and this sets you up to do that. But, you know, there's an easier way to do it, and the easier way to do it would be to say, is to use the index of method. Because what the index of method does this. It says, okay, license types. Take license types, perform the index of method, and tell me if you find entered license type somewhere in there. What did I do wrong? Oh yeah. Oh yeah, this one's a little bit more of a, you know, tricky method because what happens here is so the syntax of it, and let me let's see where can I this is the syntax. It's trying to figure out how I can explain this. The syntax for this is variable you are searching dot index of thing you are searching for, and then you have to do this comparison where if you're saying, okay, the thing I'm going to look inside of is the first variable, the first attribute or whatever. It could be a variable or an attribute, doesn't matter. In this case, it's an attribute that we're looking inside of. So we're looking inside of license types. And we say, if you find this thing in here, well, if you find it, this returns you a if you find it, it returns you a value of 1, or I think something greater than 0. I don't think if it's exact. I don't know if it's exactly 1. But if you find it, if you find S, T, or M in there, you're going to get a value greater than 0. If you don't find it in there, you're going to get a value less than 0. So then think about it. If I find it and I get something greater than 0, then my comparison will end up, let's say it returns 1. It'll be 1 greater than 0, greater than or equal to 0. Is 1 greater than or equal to 0? Yes. So then the if statement will execute and perform, the things that follow if it's a true statement. If you don't find it, then you'll receive a negative number, and then we'll say it's -1. -1 is not greater than or equal to 0, so then you don't perform the if statement. So that's how the syntax for that works. Is the first thing is the thing you want to search inside of. So you want to look inside of license type. You do your .indexOf method, and then the parameter that you put in the parentheses is the thing that you're looking for. I'm looking for an S inside of license types. Is it in there? If it is, I'm going to get something greater than 0. If it's not, I'm going to get something less than 0. So then that's why it'll turn into a very simple numerical comparison. I'll do it again. It's 1 or -1. That'll be how that executes. Okay. So, it says if it's true, if yes, then assign the first attribute a value of true. So then this is our true part. So then if it is true, is good input equals true now. Okay. And so that takes care of this. Right. The value of the first attribute is then checked. Okay. Okay, yeah. All right. So then, sorry, I had gotten confused. I thought there was going to be a different part, but not yet. So if that's true, so if this is true, then is good input turns into true. Then you have another if statement where it's telling you the value of the first attribute is then checked. If it is true, do the following. So then it's saying no matter what happens here, we still need to check this attribute. The value of the first attribute is then checked. Okay? If it is true, do the following. So here in this step, what we're saying is, did we find that user input inside of license types? That's all we're checking for. If we did, set the first attribute equal to true. If we didn't, well, then our attribute still equals false because we set it equal to false. Even if we didn't set it equal to false, it still equals false because the natural state of a Boolean is false. So that's all we did. Excuse me. That's all we did in this step. And now it's saying we need to check the first attribute. So let's check it. If is good input. And all this, if statement is checking is true or false because is good input represents true or false. So basically it's like if true, if false. So we're going to do the if true part right now because we have to code that out. So this is how we're checking the attribute. And I hope this makes sense to you guys because you might be like, wait, I don't get if is good input. Like, aren't we supposed to be doing a comparison or aren't we supposed to blah, blah, blah? No, is good input is a Boolean. If statements require Booleans in order to perform the method, or I'm sorry, to perform their commands, right? So Is good input is a Boolean. It represents true or false. If is good input is false, then it doesn't do the following. If it is true, it does do the following. All right, that's how we're setting it up right now, because it could turn out that here, hey, we don't find H in here, right? So if we don't find H in here in license types, is good input doesn't turn to true, because then you can't execute this if statement. So then if you don't execute this if statement, is good input remains false. So then when your if false, it's not going to do the following actions for when it is true. It'll do the action of false, which is to display an error message, and that's how we're setting that up here. So but we're just going to code out the true part. So if it's true, do the following. An object that consists of the first and second class is created. Pass the object the value entered by the user. So if we want to create an object of the first and the second class, which basically it's saying the parent and the child, if I want both of those classes inside of the object, well, I need to create the object through the child class, because the child class contains the parent class, like we were talking about before. So then I would have to use the license type class and say we're going to call this license. We're going to call the object license, and then we do new license type. Then we want to pass it the thing entered by the user. Entered license type. Oop. All right, and that's that. So that's how we created our object called license, and this object called license has the parent and the child class within it. License type is a child. State or territory is the parent, but since license type is the child class, it already contains the parent. All right, and then we pass it. It says pass it the input from the user. So we pass it, and let's just see what happens to it at license type. So when we pass it, it receives it. It does this comparison. If license types equals S, assign it the state array. If it doesn't equal S, assign it the territory array. And then we return whatever is assigned to our appropriate array attribute. So that's what's going to happen once we execute this one command here. All right, so then we created that and we passed it the value. Call a method through the object, and the value returned is assigned to a variable that represents an array. Okay, so I don't like what they did here. I really don't like that. So we know that we're going to call a method through the license object, and we said this is what we had to do. We had to declare a variable that was a string array data type, but they called it appropriate array. I really don't like that name. The reason I don't like that name is because you already use appropriate array here. So you're kind of saying, like, I mean, I get what he's trying to do, which is like, okay, you're going to return appropriate array, and then you will assign it to like, you're basically assigning the same thing to itself. So, appropriate array, after you're done doing something in this class. Whoa, my mouse got big. It like turns big. Whatever, I'm sorry. But you perform some stuff here, and at the end of it, appropriate array either holds the state array or it holds the territory array. And you're going to return it here through the license object. and then you're going to assign it to something called appropriate array. I don't like using the same names for things because it gets confusing, so I'm just going to call it array1. Hope you guys don't mind, but I really dislike using like the same names throughout like different classes, you know, because in this class you're going to be doing different stuff with that array than what you were doing here, you know. So I don't know, that's just kind of how I look at it. So I'm just call it array1, and then so yeah, it's asking you to use the object that you created to call a method that returns the appropriate array, and then you assign that to a array variable. You know, we broke it down up here, so that's pretty much how you do that. We declared our string array data type, we called our array something, and then we set that equal to an object calling on the method to return, you know, the appropriate array from the child class, because here you decide which array you're actually going to use. Here you define the arrays, you define them, you return them, but here through this if statement, through this if else statement, you find out what is the correct array to use. You know, if the license type is equal to S, you use the state. If not, then you know you're going to use the territory array, and this will take care of which array you're going to use, and then you return it. Here you receive it, and then assign it to array1. So then that takes care of this step. And then the array values are displayed in the terminal box. Okay, so then we know that we have to do a system out. So system out print array values are semicolon. And then the interesting part here is getting out all of those values from the array itself. Array 1 is holding, you know, it's either holding north, south, east, or it's holding Texas, Utah, and California, right? So if you look at the visual, you have your array values are, and then north, south, east, or Texas, Utah, California. So we know how to get array values are, but how do we get north, south, east, and Texas, Utah, California? How do we get it from array 1? You know, how do we, whichever one we're trying to pull, how do we get it? So we're going to have to use a for loop, because for loops are really useful when trying to get data out of an array, because arrays have multiple elements inside them, and it's kind of redundant to, you know, say something like this, like system, we'll do it here, kind of redundant to say array 0 plus array you know, this is a very ineffective way to go through an array and get data from it. Is, you know, you're just like, okay, give me array 0, give me array 1, give me array 2. Like right now we're only dealing with 3 things in our array, but what if you have 150,000? Like if you have 150,000 things in your array, like that's a lot. You know, you don't want to go ahead and type out 0 through 150,000 trying to get back the data you need. So this is why we use for loops, because for loops allow you to use loop control variables in order to pull that data out in very simple pieces of code. so we do our for loop. For int loop count equals 0. As long as my loop count is less than the length of my array1, oh sorry, and then we're going to increment loop count. Okay. You know, we only want to loop for the length of our array. Our array has 3 things. So, and you start at 0. You always start at 0. So, that's how our for loop is going to work. And then you can actually do your system out print line. And then you can say array1 loop count. And then add a space, because as you see in your output, north, south, east are spaced out. They're not, if I didn't add this space here, then they would all come out like stuck together. Okay, but this is the point of the loop here, is you have array 1 that holds all the values, but like I said, you don't want to go and type out array 0, array 1, array 2, give me all that stuff back. You don't want to do it like that. You want to do it in a more efficient way that takes a lot less coding. And you create the for loop. You start your loop count at 0 because arrays start at 0, so you want to make sure that the loop count has a chance to pull that first element out. Your loop count is gonna loop. Your loop is gonna loop for the length of the array1, and you represent that here by saying array1.length. Let's loop for that length, and then you're gonna increment loop count. Every time you loop, you're gonna do the system out print line, and since these are not system print lns, because you see that everything comes out all on one line. Its array values are, colon, and then north, south, east, or Texas, Utah, California. It's all on one line. If I did ln up here, then the line would break after array values are, and then north, south, east would appear at the bottom of array values are, and we don't want that. We want it all on one line. That's why it's system out print and not system out print ln. That's why we did that. And so this allows us to get those values back. And then the next step, okay, so the values are displayed in the terminal box. And if this if statement is false, is that aligned? Yeah. Then we have our else, which is you get some error message. And so then our error message is a system out print line. And the system out print line reads like this: you entered, okay, here you have to be very, be very aware that you are displaying what the user entered. So the user entered H in the visual, and then it says you entered H. Only one of the following letters is allowed. So if I enter V, I want to tell the user you entered V. We only are allowing these characters. So then the variable here that represents what the user enters is represented by entered license type. So I'm going to say you entered the entered license type, which represents whatever the user enters. And then I can go ahead and say period, only one of the following letters is allowed. And I would do the same thing here, Um, they don't have a space between the colon and the STM, so I'm just gonna leave it the way they have it. Um, the only one of the following letters is allowed. Plus, what represents the letters that are allowed? Well, license types represents that. So then that's how I would write out that error message, you know. And let me just double check, make sure it's all right. I am missing one thing. ln here, and then a system print ln. Now, I mean, these two things I added here, and then the ln here. These are very tedious, like annoying kind of like details that you don't really think about in the moment, especially when you're like going through all this very like complicated coding. The reason they have the system print ln here is because if you notice where it says press any key to continue, that is at the bottom of, you know, all the terminal box messages. And the way to get it to the bottom of all the terminal box messages is to kind of just put in an empty system out print line so that it can break that press any key to continue. Because if you didn't have this, then that press any key to continue would pop up all on one line too, where it says array values are Texas, Utah, California, and then it would be press any key to continue all on the same line. And you don't want that. So then this is why they did the system out print ln. And then here it's the same, you know, it's going to display this, but then since it has the ln, it's going to break that press any key to continue. It's gonna break that line so that it could be below it. So yeah, that pretty much does it for this quiz. Let's go ahead and run it. Let me get rid of this. All right, let's run this. This might take a second because my computer is beautifully slow. Where we at? All right, so let's go ahead and enter it in the order they do it here. We do S. So we do S. Array values are Texas, Utah, California. Okay, let's run it again. We'll do M. Array values are north, south, east. Okay, and I don't get the press any key to continue on my terminal box, so you know, you can't really see the press any key to continue. But yeah. And now let's try the H. You entered H. Only one of the following letters is allowed. STM. Let's do a different one. Different letter. Hello. Let's do C. You entered C. Only one of the following letters is allowed. All right. So that's pretty much how this program works. You know, I would say that, excuse me, I'm about to sneeze. Sorry, excuse me if that was super loud on your headphones or however you're listening, but I would say that man, honestly, the most annoying part is probably like this, that like very sneaky system, that very sneaky empty system out print line to break that press any key to continue. But honestly, I wouldn't even sweat it, because if you miss that, there's like a pretty good chance they won't take off, or like they'll take off like half a point, which is nothing, you know. So it's not nothing to stress about. I would say like most of the things that I've stressed over, you know, the course of me doing some of these quiz reviews, is understanding those kind of vague instructions where they're like include any other methods. you have to see what the relationships are between each class to understand what will be needed that they haven't explicitly told you. For the most part, there'll be return methods, but like I always say, don't count on it. Um, yeah, that was like one big thing here that I saw, because you went from returning from the parent class and then returning in the child class. Um, Also, pulling data out from pulling data out from arrays through loops. That's like a very that could be a very confusing concept. Um, but I will definitely make some videos on that. Just because I don't like to go too much into depth about it in the quiz review because it takes up a lot of time. But um, understanding that concept is very key. Is efficiently pulling data out from arrays through loops, because there's definitely practice quizzes where I think it gives you like a pretty ugly amount of things to pull out through loops. So um, I mean, it gives you like ugly, like pretty dense arrays, and you don't want to code all that out. You want to use loops to do all the work for you. So that I think pretty much does it for this quiz. I think I broke down for the most part a lot of the things in pretty decent detail. I really do expect for some of you guys to put in the work as well and not just depend on these videos. The more you practice on your own, the more sense these videos should make, or the more useless these videos will be, because you practice enough where you feel like you don't have to really spend an hour or an hour and a half watching videos. So um, please practice. You know, practice some of these methods like index of or dot equals, or um, look over some of these pieces of code like calling methods through objects and then setting some stuff into a string array. Like that's um, a pretty dense command. It looks simple, but to understand it, you have to put in some work. So yeah, hopefully this was helpful. Again, always thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys at the next quiz review.